I have found all of the early documents for Pokemon Sun and Moon. Every single one. If you've seen my 2 deep dives on these games, you'll remember that I covered a handful of documents from that era. But now, I've found the entire archive. Not only the full documents and the full details of stuff I previously showed, but also new material that breaks completely new ground in the SUMO development timeline. The goal of this video is simple: to cover absolutely everything. This is the complete documentation of Sun and Moon, and I'm essentially treating this like a resource for anyone that wants to follow along. Bottom line, this is all lost content, and I've compiled it all in order to the best of my ability for you. If you could do me a favor and leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, it would make my day. With that being said, please sit back and enjoy the video. To begin, we need to establish the exact origins of Generation 7. As it turns out, they trace back to a series of meetings held just before the release of X and Y. So the earliest Generation 7 documents all date to October 7, 2013, just 5 days before Generation 6 would release. At this point, Generation 7 had a working title that you've probably never heard of before: Project Next. And very quickly, the documents dive into the initial ideas for the packaged Pokemon. The legendary Pokemon in Next are amazing. Version 1 has a male-like legendary Pokemon, and version 2 has a female-like legendary Pokemon. If you collect both and trigger an event, a legendary Pokemon that looks like a child would appear. Alongside this was a diagram of this legendary trio, placeholder silhouettes, but clearly depicting that the offspring would be a mix of the mascots of each version. The notes continue. This childlike legendary Pokemon evolves. It will be packaged as a third version. After the sequels in Generation 5 and the cancelled Pokemon Z, this shows that Game Freak was still open to the idea of returning to the traditional third version model. Also, it seems that in this plan, the child legendary would have been the cover mascot, not Necrozma. The event itself was designed to be triggered only once per save file, encouraging players to trade for the opposite version to unlock it. The documents even call out how this would betray conventional wisdom, since legendary Pokemon normally don't evolve or have offspring. Beyond the legendaries, the first meeting was packed with ambitious gameplay ideas too, such as a concept that considered letting players carry multiple sets of parties at once, with full access to organize your PC from anywhere, a feature that would arrive in later generations. There was also a proposal for a Generation 7 DLC model. Keep in mind, this was pitched alongside the third version. Game Freak described it as including new Pokemon, additional maps, additional events, additional trainers, and providing never-ending fun. There was also a survival mode. This concept would come up multiple times in development, but in this version, you'd start trapped in a facility with no Pokemon or tools. Early on, you'd meet a Pokemon, and together you'd try to escape. The gameplay loop involved elements of luck and knowledge, said to be inspired by roguelikes, and one of the goals was to push players into using Pokemon they'd normally never try. Also an early version of a trainer battle royale, which was a 32-player knockout tournament, using last trainer standing rules. A simplified version of this would appear in the final game. In Pokemon Island, the protagonist would discover a deserted island and build it up over time, using their Pokemon to gather resources and construct facilities. I see it as an early blend of Pelago and Dragon Quest builders. In Next, the protagonist himself will surf, which would become a minigame in the Ultra games. Hawaii was already mentioned too, meaning the setting had already been decided by this point. It's worth highlighting that you'd use a surfboard to surf the waters, and smaller Pokemon would be able to ride along. The GB Work emulator was another interesting idea, where you could play previous games like Red and Green on the bottom screen, and transfer the Pokemon you caught into Next. While we never got this specific feature, and Gen 1 did release on the Virtual Console with bank compatibility, which I'm totally fine with, it's ideas like this that I think actually puts Game Freak in a good light, especially with how consumer plus this is. Also, there was a move inspired by Kamehameha, which was presented as a direct nod to Hawaiian culture. Now there's a lot of ideas on this page alone, and there's still a lot more to cover in the video, so let me just flick through the rest, and you guys can pick apart and analyze these in the comments. From here, the pages expand into even more crazy details. Right away, one dev note stood out to me. Next is for the 3DS, or its successor, which perfectly lines up with what we talked about in SUMO Part 2, where for a period of time, Game Freak wasn't sure whether Generation 7 would launch on the 3DS or the Switch. Seeing it referenced here again, in the very first batch of meetings, is insane, and really reinforces the alternate timeline, where Sun and Moon was a Switch launch title. The earliest spark of what would become Pokemon Pelago can be found here too. This initial version was described as a mechanic where you could release Pokemon from your boxes to live on an island. You'd check in on their progress over time and even see them adopted by other trainers. Another developer then built on that idea, pushing it closer to the final version of Pelago, and also creating a mock-up for the island's map. Honestly, this whole pitch kind of reminds me of Pokemon Ranch, and much like with Pokemon Finder being inspired by Pokemon Snap, maybe that was the same case here. Moving on to Document 2, this one feels a lot more concrete and closer to what we'd eventually see in Generation 7. Things like QR codes being implemented into gameplay are already here, but the document actually starts with something much more surprising, the earliest mention of a gym building feature. At this stage, it was called My Gym. The description states, the main character could create their own gym, customize their gym equipment, likely referring to layout and design, and scout gym trainers. This directly lines up with a recruiting gym leaders concept I covered in a previous deep dive, except this reference predates that information entirely, so this is actually the earliest root of the feature in Generation 7. There's also a note about conquering other players' gyms, which sounds like the intended multiplayer component. As more trainers visit, the gym can be expanded, like adding floors to a building, so not only would you design and recruit for your gym, but you'd also be able to literally build it into a multi-level facility. Directly underneath, we find the earliest draft of story-related lore, and I quote, "A bittersweet love triangle. The story is based on a story with 3 main characters. Throughout the entire story, you will generally act as a group of 3. Now I'm not entirely sure if love triangle is a mistranslation, but the most obvious comparison here is the trio of a protagonist, Lily and Hal. In the final game, they are far less tightly bound, with Lily having her own arc with Nebby, and Hal serving more as a traditional rival, but the structure of a main character trio seems to have originated right here. Next, we have something called parallel Pokemon. These are described as Pokemon that arrive through parallel holes connected to parallel worlds and exist only in this region. Their shape, evolutionary stage, and abilities differ from normal Pokemon, so it seems to be the very earliest draft of the Ultra Wormholes and Ultra Space concept. But more importantly, these parallel Pokemon sounds like the original plan for Alolan forms, as it seems to be exclusive to National Dex Pokemon. But rather than being regional forms, it says that these Pokemon couldn't leave the area around the parallel holes. Then we have some text on the package Pokemon. It's explained as a creature brought by a girl from another world. It has the ability to open a parallel hole, and evolves in 2 stages to become the package Pokemon, with branched evolutions. If we put this into final game terms, the girl from another world is clearly an early draft of Lily, and the Pokemon she brings with her is an early Nebby. The mystery of this duo would then unfold over the course of the game, but then we get something crazy. The proposed gimmick of Origin Reboot. According to the example, Pikachu and Pachirisu were once the same species tens of thousands of years ago. By rebooting them, they would transform back into their shared origin form, before they branched off. This process would only be possible in the next region, thanks to its special space-time properties. This is a whole nother level of Pokemon World lore, but I hope is actually canon, as it provides a scientific explanation to all of the Pikachu clones, and why some Pokemon look similar to others. The next pages delve into a feature called Friend Dungeons, which were described as the successor to Friend Safari. Each friend code would generate a dungeon that your friends could enter. Battle College was designed to teach players battle strategy through quizzes and simulations, inspired by the classroom in Pokemon Stadium 2. The hosts were pitched as either Giovanni himself, or a brand new character in the form of Giovanni's daughter. Again, we have so much more to go through, so let me just flick through the rest of the highlights. Moving on to Document 3, this is where we really dive into the deep end of the October 2013 iceberg. Because here, we find something huge, the very first names pitched for the Alola region. These were among the suggestions, each of which derived from Hawaiian language and culture. Underneath, we are introduced to something called the Steam Form Change Proposal. From what I can gather, this was meant to be a new form for Rotom. The design notes suggest a form powered by steam, supposedly built over 200 years ago, and harnessed the steam technology. Honestly, this feels more in line with something we'd expect in Legends Arceus than Sun and Moon. As far as I can tell, the concept never made it past this stage, and was never brought up again, and this is indeed the discovery of said Rotom form. The next section focuses on a diving mechanic. Specifically, the fun of encountering rare Pokemon while exploring underwater. When you dive into the ocean, you'll find a vast 3D map. Pokemon appear as 3D models on the map, resulting in symbolic encounters. This ties directly into the ambitious diving discussions we covered in Sun and Moon Part 2. The 3D models of Pokemon underwater is wild though. Such a huge idea for the 3DS. No wonder it didn't make it into the final game, though I'm 99.999% sure that we will get this in a future game. Among a written philosophy for this diving mechanic, there's even a map of Oahu, marking potential diving spots and coral reefs, along with notes about the Pokemon that would inhabit them. Never noticed until now just how close Oahu's shape is to Melemele Island. There's also notes stating that turtles are found everywhere, and a push for a brand new sea turtle Pokemon. While Turtonator wasn't quite a sea turtle, it's still a turtle Pokemon, and it became one of my favorite Pokemon from the game, so I'm not mad. Another ambitious idea was the push for seamless cutscenes integrated into the gameplay, which was inspired by other games. Just 4 days later, Pokemon X and Y released worldwide. With that milestone hit, Game Freak could now start shifting more resources towards Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and the early development of Generation 7. Over the course of October, Game Freak continued tossing around potential features for Generation 7. Unlike some of the earlier documents, most of these mid-October concepts never went anywhere, but there were a few interesting standouts. One was a Safari Zone-like minigame, while another was a team-based mode where you could form squads and compete in 5-on-5 battles. Much like the scrapped recruiting gym leaders feature we covered before, this version lets you recruit characters to your team. One of the mockups even show a lineup, mixing gym leaders with other characters. Then towards the end of October, we find the very first mention of a battle cruise, or as it was titled in this draft, the Champions Cruise. If you remember from the previous deep dives, this was one of the most ambitious features Game Freak ever put on paper, a cruise ship where you travel the Pokemon world, battling trainers from past games. And here, we finally have the full description of the initial idea. The Champions Cruise would unlock in the post-game, accessible only to special trainers. Once aboard, the cruise would act as a central hub for battle-related facilities, directly compared to the Battle Frontier from past titles. Each guest room on the ship would house a trainer you could challenge and eventually befriend. You could also scout certain trainers as partners for multi-battles and team battles, building directly on the scrapped partner recruitment concept we just covered. Battles would also take place up on the deck, and this facility would act almost like a battle house. There was also a training center planned, essentially a full Pokemon battling simulator. Here players would face quiz-based scenarios on how to counter specific strategies, or test themselves with rental Pokemon. Another area even lets you watch battle replays, almost like a theater of past matches. The ship was filled with side facilities like a daycare, and events would be held according to the day of the week. and trainers would appear in the event hall, allowing you to deepen your bonds. The deeper your relationship with a trainer, the more you could do with them, eventually even trading Pokemon. The crews would constantly be on the move. At this point, the idea was that the crews would only visit 2 to 3 different ports. One of these ports was planned to be Vermilion City in Kanto. The document also includes 2 separate concepts of what the cruise ship could have looked like. Honestly, just looking at the sheer level of detail here, and the fact the Battle Cruise even had its own dedicated planning document, unlike other concepts at the time, really shows just how much weight it carried. As you'll see later in the video, this wouldn't even be the last time the feature came up during development. Moving into November, we get a new set of documents. Starting with a concept pitch for a villa. This villa was envisioned as a large hub with multiple facilities. One of the most notable areas in the villa was a ranch designed to make Pokemon egg hatching more convenient than ever. Here you'd be able to mass hatch multiple eggs at once, and even release newly hatched Pokemon straight into the ranch to prevent filling up your boxes. Visitors could enter your ranch and attempt to catch Pokemon themselves, though there was a limit on how many they could actually take with them. It seems that rather than being a place where you'd house your own Pokemon, the villa would serve more as a breeding ground and hatching facility, while also doubling as a location for new encounters. Several other ideas were brought up in the same doc, like the mention of a Pokemon hospitality feature, which carried the tagline, "Become a charismatic store clerk." The idea seems to be that your character could try out different occupations, and in doing so, learn new techniques. These techniques would then feed back into the main story, boosting your stats, or otherwise giving you advantages in the game. Then on November 14, we come across the very first draft of Pokemon Hero Time, a feature we've covered in a previous deep dive, but now we have a full initial pitch. A detail that immediately stood out to me was that the idea wasn't just submitted by a single developer, it was pitched by an entire development department within Game Freak. That's something we rarely ever see in these early concepts. So again, like the Battle Cruise, this mode is something special. The concept itself was ambitious. You would begin as a regular resident of a Pokemon world, before traveling through a parallel hole into another world that operated outside of Pokemon's usual rules. This was directly compared to the Riolu Kid story from PokeStar Studios. But here the idea was to make that same kind of experience actually happen in a canonical setting. You'd only be able to take one Pokemon with you, which is your sidekick, and the battle descriptions make it clear that these encounters would have felt similar to PokeStar's style of battles. Among the more experimental ideas of this era, there was also a fun pitch for a box battle. This concept was simple but insane. Each player selects an entire PC box containing up to 30 Pokemon, and the 2 boxes would battle it out against each other. Yup, full 30v30 matches. Sounds quite chaotic, but honestly I think it would have been pretty fun. Another notable draft is the Legend Gate document. Unlike the Ultra games, where legendaries were tied to Ultra Space, the original plan was for players to track down special gates and summon legendaries using a kind of ticket system. The description is a bit confusing in places, but it does mention that the associated minigame could be played in co-op with up to 4 other players. The document even included a full list of legendary Pokemon that would have been available through this mechanic. From here we move into December, where Game Freak began brainstorming companion smartphone apps to tie into the upcoming generation. The first was a daycare app, followed by the full presentation for the Pokemon Breeder app that we fully covered in a previous deep dive. The working title was Pokemon Nursery. The idea was that players would take on the role of a Pokemon farmer, raising Pokemon from eggs. You could feed them, brush them, walk them, and generally care for them until they were fully grown. The app was planned as a free-to-download title, but like many mobile apps at the time, the free section of the game would have a limited amount of playtime. Players who owned the Generation 7 games would then be able to transfer Pokemon between the main games and the app. In that sense, it feels like a cross between elements of a Pokewalker and mechanics we'd later see in Pokemon Go. another proposed app was called Pokemon Book, envisioned as an interactive diary for trainers. The details are a little vague, but it seems that the app would connect with Sun and Moon, allowing users to send Pokemon over, customize their experience, and even capture new Pokemon that could then be transferred into the mainline games. There were also references to battle functions and additional trainer customization. The idea seems to be a part of a broader push to tie Pokemon more directly into players' daily lives, much like what we'd later see with apps like Pokemon Sleep. But despite progressing for a couple of months, Pokemon Book never made it past the planning stage. There's also another document that revisits the Pokemon Nursery concept in more detail, this one dated April 2014. By then, the idea had evolved into something with more of a narrative. Players would step into the shoes of a breeder who had just opened their business. You'd receive requests for eggs, and your job was to hatch and raise the Pokemon accordingly. By this stage, the monetization model had shifted too. Rather than offering a free limited version, the app was restructured into a completely free game in hopes of attracting a much wider audience. Next, I want to highlight some of the earliest battle concept documents, dating from late 2013 into early 2014. First up is the Survival Island document from December 20th, 2013. This mode would throw players onto an island where various giant mechanical Pokemon, essentially mecha Pokemon, would spawn and attack. The document even includes one of the very first visual mockups, showing what these robotic Pokemon might have looked like. The structure of the mode was simple. Players could team up with companions, either through local communication or with NPC allies, and attempt to hold out as long as possible. When one mecha Pokemon was defeated, another would immediately appear, ensuring the player was never without an opponent. The objective was to see how many mecha Pokemon you could take down within a strict time limit. Each player would enter the island with a team of 3 Pokemon, but because they were fighting mechanical enemies, these battles were meant to be much tougher than regular encounters. We also see the earliest version of Generation 7's battle gimmick. At this stage, it was called Miracle Aura. Pokemon would hold Miracle Stones, which would later become Z Crystals, and activating them would surround the Pokemon in a special aura, granting them access to a 5th move slot and a powerful new move. However, on the next page, there was an alternate idea called Guardian. In this version, giving your Pokemon a special item would allow them to summon a Guardian Spirit of the same type. This Guardian would have moves of the same type, and effectively act as the user of those techniques. Once used, the Guardian would disappear. Hearing this idea and the blank item label immediately makes me think of a strange souvenir from X and Y, which many believe foreshadowed the Alolan Guardians. But with this new context, it could have possibly hinted at the Guardian gimmick too, and perhaps you'd give an item just like this to your Pokemon in order to initiate the Guardian mechanic. Regardless, it's a great example of how future region teasers may not always play out how you might expect. As we enter 2014, the first batch of documents offer a handful of fascinating miscellaneous concepts. One of the strangest was this list of support skill features. These were described as field abilities that were activated on the field with the help of Pokemon, so it seems to be the earliest prototype of what would eventually become Ride Pokemon. The list of support skill Pokemon is surprisingly extensive too, alluding that the initial purpose was to replace every single HM, as well as provide additional features. Some of these, like Surf and Flying, clearly made it into the Ride system, but I would go as far as to say most of these ideas were dropped, as they had no use in the final Alola region map. Still pretty fascinating to look at. Then we arrive at January 15, 2014, the date of the initial Sun and Moon presentation and the promotional video. This is the moment where, after weeks of internal meetings, Game Freak locked in their first official plan for Generation 7. The presentation was headlined by Pokemon's latest project proposal and laid out the core vision for the next generation. At this stage, both the title and platform were undecided, but a release window was already targeted for October 2016. Game Freak would also outline 2 key themes for the project. When it came to the first theme, Game Freak highlighted that Generation 7 would coincide with the 20th anniversary, and reflect on how each generation brought along their own theme. Red and Green introduced playability. Gold and Silver established it with types and breeding. Ruby and Sapphire expanded it with natures and double battles. Diamond and Pearl enhanced it through Wi-Fi and DS tech. Black and White pushed communication even further, and X and Y expanded that communication globally. By 2014, Game Freak felt that while Pokemon had evolved with the gaming industry, certain aspects of the system were outdated. So rather than just adding to the existing system, they wanted Generation 7 to push boundaries, and they wanted to reassess the production of a Pokemon game. I'm sure this whole situation is linked to Masuda's era of domination, as you may have learned from Terra League 2. So the first theme was Transcend, to break out of your shell and go beyond your limits. In the latest title, Game Freak were not limited to expanding and enhancing the gameplay, but rethinking the basic game system, and were aiming to create a new standard that is not bound by existing concepts. They were intending to study the state of the gaming industry and the preference of users to create a new system for Pokemon, and I want to specifically put emphasis on this quote here. Over the next 10 years, we aim to establish a foundation that will enable us to create a brand that will continue to be loved more than ever before, transcending time, generations, and cultures. Going on a slight tangent, looking back now, a full 10 years later, while Sun and Moon may not have fully transcended in the way the document imagined, since then, the brand as a whole has undeniably taken bold, experimental steps, whether you like it or not. And sure, while they've made some huge lapses in their judgment, with some well-deserved criticisms, they've also made some incredible steps. And that's why I'm personally optimistic about the future of Pokemon games, because in my mind, the games can only get better from here, and you really can't get any worse than Scarlet and Violet's launch on the original Switch. Anyways, back to the document. On to the second theme. This slide was about Game Freak reflecting on the evolution of communication technology and where it got to in Generation 6 with a PSS, which I think is still peak Pokemon comms even to this day. And so the second theme was share. Share your emotions and feel the same time and space. This was all about expanding multiplayer and communal features, letting players feel more connected as if they were living in the same world together. Again, while the final Sun and Moon didn't fully realize this vision, the broader Pokemon series has pushed into these ideas over the last decade. The next few slides delve into the worldview of Generation 7, including the scenario, Pokemon evolution, and the adventure setting. Scenario 1 is about the story of how the Pokemon League came to be, and to convey gratitude to Pokemon. It's almost written like a prophecy. There is no Pokemon League, but there is a region where people and Pokemon live together in harmony. Islands floating in the clear sea, the story begins on one of these islands. These are also the earliest pieces of work-in-progress concept art ever made for Generation 7. These aren't even the final versions, as you'll find later in the video. Groundbreaking pieces of history here. Scenario 2 focused on reconnecting with a younger audience by returning to the series' roots and making the protagonist younger again, and Scenario 3 featured the earliest synopsis for the game. One day, the protagonist is involved in an accident in which the bridge collapses while trying to rescue a mysterious Pokemon lying helplessly on the bridge. Another gigantic Pokemon suddenly appears to save him from his predicament. It looks exactly like the legendary Pokemon he saw in a story as a child. An encounter with a mysterious girl who claims a mysterious Pokemon as her friend. The story of the steady progress of a Pokemon League on an island without one, the progress of a nature conservation foundation, which aims to protect Pokemon, and the appearance of a parallel hole that connects to another world. So it seems the initial story involved the protagonist going on a journey to say thank you to the legendary Pokemon that saved him. Interestingly, the bridge incident was meant to be this major dramatic moment central to the story. In the final game, I felt the impact of it on the overall story was reduced quite a lot, and was mainly there to introduce Tapu Koko. Still, at least the sequence wasn't cut. Next time you watch this cutscene, you will now know the original ideas and intentions behind it. It was now clear that Parallel Evolution was the prototype name for regional forms, but it seems the idea to tie them directly to the parallel holds had been scrapped, and instead these were alternate evolutions based on Pokemon adapting to the area. As depicted on this slide, it's not necessarily a regional form, but rather if Pichu grew up in the volcanic areas of a region, it would evolve into a fire-type Pokemon. Some Pokemon even had multiple evolution conditions, teasing more than just one alternate form. Moving on to the battle section, first of all, seamless transitions into the battle were indeed planned. Again, way ahead of its time for Pokemon. Miracle Aura was now locked in as the generation's main battle mechanic, serving as the foundation for Z moves. It seems Game Freak saw both the regional forms and Miracle Aura as the two gimmicks of Generation 7, encouraging to use both, opening up new possibilities. Totem Pokemon appeared here too, under the name Boss Pokemon, and Battle Royale was carried over unchanged. The Battle Cruise was also confirmed as a major feature. The idea was also fleshed out here, including the presence of brand new mockups. Important to note that if the protagonist performed well on the battle deck, you'd be invited to ports in other regions such as Vermilion City and Castelia City, each of which being added as destinations. If certain conditions were met, the gym leaders and champions of those regions may even board the ship. Receiving multiple slides in the presentation, clearly this was one of the big plans for the generation. It's a shame they couldn't pull it off. The Legend Gate concept also appeared again, with detailed gameplay flows outlining exactly how it would function, and finally, the presentation closed with a mock-up promotional video, headlined by the tagline, "Over the rainbow, share the world." This served as the guiding motto for Generation 7's development going forward. I'll play the video right now. And with that, Game Freak now had a concrete plan and cemented their vision for Generation 7. Then just a few days later, Game Freak would draft the first iteration of Melemele Island. We've looked at a visual of this map before, but now we have the full descriptions and labels for this island. To break it down simply, the red blocks are Pokemon centers, the pink blocks indicate interior buildings with events, the orange blocks were gates or warps, and I'm guessing the white blocks represent cave-like interiors. The island was structured quite differently than in the final game too, and now we know that the central path was labelled as a highway running across the island, something that was eventually scrapped. I do wonder what the highway system would have looked like, or the initial philosophy for it, but we don't have that answer here. Let me know what you think. Some names were already set in stone, like Howley City and 10 Carat Hill had their final names by this stage, but a new detail is that Icky Town was originally called Lily Town. There's also an early plan for a diving spot on Melemele Island, a truly incredible piece of scrapped content, considering diving was completely gone in the final game. Even more importantly, this document included a list of Pokemon that would inhabit the island. Many of these entries represent the earliest descriptions of Generation 7 Pokemon. A small but crucial detail here is that Alolan Rattata was labelled Rattata Alola 1. This is likely the seed of a naming convention for regional forms. During this early period, Game Freak also drafted various scenario documents exploring the philosophy behind the region. Remember, at this point, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were deep into production, so what I'm about to cover was still under the pre-production label for Generation 7. One standout proposal detailed a plan for underwater ruins. These would be submerged at the bottom of the sea in the center of the next region, made by highly civilized people. it is said to be a city built by people from around the world, but are connected to the parallel hole. Honestly, this whole scenario kind of reminds me of One Piece, especially concepts like the Ancient Kingdom and Fishman Island. The ruins were described as donut-shaped, and the source of a parallel hole, with the Aether Foundation's facility constructed directly above it to conceal its existence. The facility that opens the Foundation's parallel hole was built to cover the underwater ruins, with the top part of the Foundation's headquarters protruding above sea level. To put it into the final game's terms, the Aether Foundation was built on top of the underwater ruins as a means to hide it. I can honestly see this still being a part of off-screen Pokemon canon, especially since it's written in the earliest scenario documents. I'll personally take it as an explanation for the location of a man-made island. Thematically, the ruins tied into one of the game's key mysteries. Why did ancient cities perish and become ruins? Luckily for you, we have a full true story written right here. The backstory explains that the parallel hole once unleashed a terrifying Pokemon into the world, bringing disaster to people, Pokemon, and nature alike. The city's people, wielding two powerful Pokemon of their own, managed to defeat and capture the beast. To seal it away, they sacrificed their own city by sinking it beneath the sea. Then in the modern day, this terrifying Pokemon would reawaken, intended to serve as the third package Pokemon. Based on this line, this could have been an early idea for Necrozma, or perhaps an alternate concept for Cosmog's final evolution. Characters descended from the people of the ancient city would also appear in the story, with subtle design differences setting them apart from the people of a new region. Their tale would then be told through folklore, ghost stories, and children's songs, passed down as a warning to never approach the ancient city. The last known descendant was imagined as a boy, destined to serve as the caretaker of the ancient city. It's even possible this boy was meant to resemble N, or even the protagonist of the story. This is some of the deepest lore and story material we've ever seen for early Generation 7, and raises incredible questions about how Sun and Moon could have played out, as well as unintentionally provide so much more lore to the Alola region. Here's the meeting where they decided to scrap gyms for a unique Pokemon League structure, a truly monumental moment in the pre-production phase. I also found the very first story draft for the game, dated December 6, 2013. It's a very long document, so first I'll go over the highlights and summarize it, then flick through all the pages so you can read them yourself. So the story starts off very similar to the opening sequence in the final game, featuring a girl clutching a mysterious Pokemon and running from a foundation. Then the story would transition into a TV segment involving the player's mother. From there, the flow matches the final game. The professor invites you to Eki Town and introduces you to the early game mechanics, then the bridge sequence would follow. And afterwards you would meet Lily, leading up to the starter Pokemon sequence. Though it seems that at this point, Lily wasn't the professor's assistant. The professor's lab was also located in Howley City, and you'd need the professor's cruiser to travel to the next island. But before that, you'd be tasked to investigate and record a specific Pokemon in a nearby cave. It seems you'd have different options of paths to take too, but ultimately the events would play out the same. Then just as you found the Pokemon, the region's gang would show up behind you. Team Skull had not yet been decided as a name. Then after defeating them, you'd return to the lab, and the professor would explain why he tasked you with investigating the Pokemon, and you would then set sail with the professor to the next island. It appears there would have been some kind of sea travel demo here, further reinforcing one of my theories that originally you were able to actually travel the Alolan seas. The Foundation headquarters would also be shown along the way, as the professor explained what it was. On the second island, you'd meet the leader of the island, who was associated with a battle academy. They would then explain that the region had no gyms and no Pokemon League. The substitutes for gym badges had not yet been decided, but this is where that mechanic would be explained. The other three leaders would then be invited, users of fire, water, and grass Pokemon, and you would officially be challenged to defeat all of them. They would then return to their respective islands, and you'd be able to tackle each leader in any order. Your adventure on the second island would then climax as you battle the island leader, and from here, the professor and the girl would remain on the island while the protagonist would travel on. The story would then branch into multiple threads, involving the villain gang, the Foundation, and events related to parallel evolution. Other story beats involved exploring the ruins with a girl and learning the mythology of a region, which directly ties with the underwater ruins we just covered. Remember, that was supposed to be a mystery that unfolds throughout the game, but now you know the full history of what really happened. Then you'd visit the Foundation, Just like in the final game, it would be explained that the Foundation's purpose is to protect Pokemon, and also to protect Pokemon in other worlds. Names like Giratina would be dropped, as an explanation for why they're researching parallel worlds. The text even teased the existence of many parallel holds around the world, intentionally setting up potential story hooks for future generations. There's not a whole lot of details on the third island, but like the final game, this is where you were introduced to the Pokemon League construction, and that's where this earliest story draft concluded. I'm gonna flick through the whole draft now, so if you want to read it yourself you can. It's worth emphasizing that this is the earliest story draft, and it comes from late 2013. There would be multiple drafts following this, each time getting closer to the final version, but it is absolutely crazy that we get to see something as historic as this. As we move into 2014, Game Freak's focus was firmly on the development of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Those games would eventually wrap up in August 2014, with development on Generation 7 ramping up around that time. One of the most intriguing ideas from this period comes from June 2014, when Game Freak designed the concept for a flying type evolution. The design was seemingly close to being finalized, but the idea completely halted after concerns that it resembled a popular fan-made design. It's also stated that the redesigns would have been extremely costly, and unless the new Eevee was tied to a major minigame or had a prominent role in the story, Game Freak decided not to invest further for the time being. Sadly, the idea was shelved permanently. I think the biggest surprise here is that a new evolution was completely abandoned over budget reasons, considering that probably would have made a huge return on investment. I don't want to particularly highlight any financial documents or get too deep into that field, but I do want to bring up the fact that there are tons of documents from this era focused on keeping up with sales charts and comparisons to Yokai Watch, which was exploding in popularity at the time. As we discussed in SUMO Part 2, Sun and Moon in many ways were Game Freak's direct response to Yokai Watch, and these financial reports only push that conversation further. Anyways, here are the rest of the Pokemon design descriptions made around the same time. Then on July 24, Game Freak created an updated presentation document for Generation 7. The names of the games were still undecided, and a third theme headlined Live was added, which was the idea of presenting Pokemon as if they were truly alive. And I quote, "building a game where players felt as if the creatures were right there beside them." The concept art seen earlier was now finished too, and the parallel hole was still seen as the key to the story. Seamless battle transitions, the miracle aura mechanic, and even the battle cruise remained part of the plan. But instead of Legend Gate, a new mode called Live Caravan was introduced. This was envisioned as a multiplayer project, where players explored a mysterious island in the region, complete with real-time combat. This is likely the first concrete mention of real-time gameplay in mainline Pokemon history, which is an incredible revelation. Early slides for Live Caravan even show hints of what would later become the raid battles in Sword and Shield. Apparently there were 30 different parallel evolutions planned for the game, nearly double the 18 Alolan forms that made it into the final game. Shortly after this, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire wrapped up, and Game Freak could finally dedicate all resources to Generation 7. With a huge pre-production and program development head start behind them, they had over 2 years to complete the project. I also want to highlight all of the Alolan maps by late 2014, including all of the design annotations. We previously analysed the layout changes of these islands, so it's pretty fascinating to see all of these labels. And here's Pony Island. There's a note suggesting that an Alolan dugong was planned at this point. Another interesting observation is that the surfable waters surrounding each island were marked as Alola question mark. I wonder what that originally meant. By February 16, 2015, Game Freak created their definitive final presentation document for Generation 7. The titles Sun and Moon were officially chosen. In addition to the original 3 themes, a 4th hidden theme was introduced, called Anniversary Feeling. This was meant to celebrate Pokemon's 20th anniversary by incorporating mechanics that made players reflect on the franchise's history. The player characters were also designed by this point. We also have some never before seen concept art here, which shows that the protagonist's house was originally part of a larger town and not an isolated home. Interestingly, the lore at this time described the legendary Pokemon as having the ability to control day and night and freely manipulate time, a mechanic that never made it into the final release. We also see some of the earliest model sheets for Alolan Pokemon. Parallel evolution had officially evolved into the concept of regional species, now with just 15 planned variants. Very surprisingly, it was noted here that the base specifications of the Pokemon models would not be changed from X and Y, in order to keep costs down. I found this very interesting. You'd think Pokemon has almost an unlimited budget, and you'd assume the development issues were based on time constraints, yet at least in Sun and Moon, it sounded more like a budget problem. Like, I still don't understand why they cut that evolution. I think this is a huge revelation, because based on what we've seen in this video, the issues weren't time-based. The only issues brought up were budget-related. This is definitely a point to reference to in future Game Freak conversations. The Pokemon ride mechanic had finally been conceptualized too, along with new concept art. We'll get to more Pokeride stuff later in the video. We also have a glimpse of a Sun and Moon build from early 2015. From what I know, this was built directly on top of the ORAS repo, before Sun and Moon even got its own branch. And this part is pretty huge, expressing the lives of Pokemon in the field. There would be Pokemon that drink water from rivers, Pokemon that eat grass, and Pokemon that live with people in the overworld. I feel like what they're trying to portray here is a level of environmental immersion that still hasn't been fully realized in the series. But I'm very sure it's something Game Freak still want to implement. And maybe it's something we're starting to see in recent games, but I'm sure it's something Game Freak want to fully implement in future titles. Honestly, this idea is probably what sparked ideas like introducing the Poke Finder. One particularly fascinating scrapped feature was mini Pokemon. These were smaller versions of existing Pokemon that would follow you around in the overworld. They could also occasionally join in during battle with extra attacks or collect items in the field. Some could even reveal hidden Pokemon to photograph. In lore, they were said to come from another world through the Rainbow Gate and were cherished in Alola as messengers of God. They wouldn't appear in online battles, nor would they be compatible with Pokemon Bank. About 10 to 20 Pokemon from Generation 1 were planned as mini Pokemon, specifically as part of the anniversary celebration. I think it's a pretty smart workaround for the technical challenges of full-scale following Pokemon, especially since it's probably way easier to make silly proportionate sized Pokemon follow you around. I'm sure the whole feature was cut over these budget reasons. And here are the mockups for the visible trainers in battles. Miracle Aura had now evolved into Total Power Move, and the mockups look absolutely crazy. And this is where the planned trainer level system comes from, a feature where the protagonists themselves would gain levels and unlock new abilities. Another ambitious idea called Poke Planet was documented too, along with a developmental image. Think of it like a 3D Pokemon Pelago with Street Pass communication. Unfortunately, by this point, ambitious ideas like the Battle Cruise had been scrapped, likely due to cost or scope restraints. The presentation then closed with a bold statement. Game Freak's goal was to create the best and greatest software on the 3DS, aiming to transcend boundaries and bring smiles and excitement to the world, which definitely felt like they were going to war with Yokai Watch. But to their credit, they did push the 3DS to its absolute limits with Sun and Moon. So kudos to Game Freak. And with that, we step into 2015. Just a few days later, on Pokemon Day, Game Freak created the now infamous SUMO Zygarde document. Very poetic, given this is when Pokemon Z probably would have been announced, and then released later that year. We covered a portion of it in the Pokemon Z video, but to summarize, this is the document where Zygarde's role in Sun and Moon was conceptualized, and it remains our only direct glimpse at a Pokemon Z document, since Game Freak used it as inspiration for integrating Zygarde into Alola. By March 2015, we see a wave of Pokemon ride concepts and philosophies. Beyond the rides shown in the February presentation, Game Freak drafted full design documents for several rides that never made it into the final game, including Magnezone, Vivillon, Rapidash, Arbok, and even Persian. Magnezone was envisioned as a traversal Pokemon that let players float over obstacles and rough terrain. This mockup gives an idea of how it would have looked like. Here's actually the details of how Float was intended to be used in Sun and Moon. Remember, in the final game, none of the Pokerides made your character float in the overworld. It's also noted that increasing your trainer level would make Magnezone move faster. I really wish this made it into the game, because floating around sounds like it would have been very fun. Vivillon had a similar purpose, but instead of floating, its gimmick was jumping. Attached to the player's back, it would carry you over low steps, fences, and holes. Unfortunately, the final Alola map had no terrain designed for a jumping mechanic, rendering it useless. This in-game mockup gives us a clear idea of when a Vivillon ride would be used. And Arbok was meant to serve as a stealth ride. Riding on its back, players could press buttons to hide from Gaze trainers and sneak past. The idea seems to have evolved from a scrapped sneaky walk mechanic. I like this idea. This is something I could definitely see in the game too. It's a shame it didn't make it. Also something to note, the document suggests that Persian originally filled this role, likely with a sneaky walk mechanic, before the idea shifted to Arbok in April. And Rapidash was pitched as a high-speed traversal Pokemon, essentially a replacement for the bike and roller skates of past games. Ultimately, Tauros ended up inheriting the acceleration gimmick, and Rapidash was left behind. Regardless of its redundancy, it's sad to see that this was cut too. On April 20th, 2015, Game Freak created an incredibly detailed weather system document, updated all the way through June. This wasn't just basic weather changes, it described dynamic patterns across every map, complete with visual changes to the ocean and sky. The system even tracked the position of the sun and moon themselves, which kind of reminds me of the day and night system in Legends EA. We previously covered a multi-page cave diving document in part 2 in great detail, where it seemed they had very ambitious ideas with diving. As if that wasn't ambitious enough, I found this mockup from May 2015, visualizing the diving feature for Sun and Moon. Crazy stuff. Then on June 22nd, out of nowhere, Game Freak created a model sheet for every leader in Team Rainbow Rocket. Keep in mind, there was no mention of Team Rainbow Rocket anywhere before this. The name of the group wasn't even listed on these model sheets, and Team Rainbow Rocket didn't even appear until the Ultra Games, suggesting that they were originally meant to be in the base game. Strangely enough, Cynthia's model sheet was also created on the same day. Here's some fun concept art from the Pokemon League too, as well as some mockups using Generation 5 sprites. Then a whole 2 days after the Rainbow Rocket model sheets were created, the actual scenario document for Team Rainbow Rocket was made. According to the synopsis, with the appearance of an Ultra Hole, an entrance to another world had been created in Alola, and Giovanni, the boss of Team Rocket from Red and Green, appears. He gathers together other bosses that appeared in previous games and organizes Team Rainbow Rocket and plots to take control of Alola. It's said that this scenario would play out after you became champion, and it would serve as the introduction to the battle tree and the gym leader scouting features. This is like piecing together the puzzles and realizing 2 of the 3 puzzle pieces were cut from the final game. In the final game we only got the battle tree, but originally in the base game, we were supposed to get this Team Rainbow Rocket storyline, which would introduce us to the Gym Leader scouting features and the battle tree as an add-on. Yet in the final game we lost everything else except the battle tree. It's genuinely wild. But what's even more wild is that the document explains the backstory of each villain. Giovanni is allegedly the same person post Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Archie and Maxie came from a parallel pre-Ruby and Sapphire timeline. Cyrus is the same person after the events of Platinum. Ghetsis is the person before the events of Main Black and White, and Lysander comes from an alternate timeline, pre-X and Y events. All I have to say is wow. However you take this information and make of it is really up to you. Here is the full plot of the original Rainbow Rocket storyline too. It's honestly so much, and there's only so much I can cover here before moving on, but I do have to say it's really good. The plot itself is surprisingly deep, and really fleshes out the Rainbow Rocket cast, as well as weave in their individual stories, like setting up Ghetsis for the events in Black and White, and etc. Red and Green join the fight too. Then in the climax, Rainbow Giovanni is revealed to be an imposter, and actually a former Team Rocket member that greatly admired Giovanni. The real Giovanni would then show up in the climax too. According to the document, the real Giovanni's purpose would suggest the joy of his son as his motivation, and also one day getting revenge on Trainer Red as a strong trainer. World domination may come after that. A pretty complex written character, I must say. The story would conclude with an exchange between Red, Green and Giovanni. Green would ask Giovanni what his purpose is directly, and Giovanni would reply, "A strong man, someone my son can be proud of." It's a shame we lost 2 huge puzzle pieces in this huge planned post-game, but at least the Ultra games gave us a little more. Just a few days later, Game Freak finalized the concept of a Rotom Pokédex, complete with its own dedicated design document and some of the earliest known images of Sun and Moon's UI mockups. Some of you might find this document interesting. It's a list of characters in the game, both returning and new, as well as a little description on them. Nothing crazy to note, except for a character named Cock. On November 18, a finalized list of planned Alolan forms was created. Despite having the complete list of Alolan forms that made it into the final game, this list also included a description for Alolan Scyther. According to the description, it would have been a fairy bug type, and it would evolve into Scissor when trading with a metal coat. However, it's noted that Scissor wouldn't have an Alolan form. No clue why, again probably related to budget, but Scyther would end up being the final scrapped Alolan form. It seems that mini Pokemon were ultimately removed on December 10. Up until October 6 of 2015, the mini Pokemon feature and the motion functions would still be tweaked. The same document even has a dedicated tab detailing the motion and how it displays various emotions. There's also another document highlighting various deleted features for the game. Here's the list of all of the mini Pokemon, as well as a very deep breakdown, possibly the last iteration of the idea before it was deleted. There's also direct references to mass outbreaks, and direct acknowledgement of the cancelled DLC project. Even a breakdown of all of the gyms in Alola, including the names of the badges. I'm just saying, if anyone ever makes a Pokemon Stars ROM hack, there's a lot of material to pull from. And here's a few glimpses of the game in November 2015. Speaking of gyms, it seems Game Freak was still actively developing the Gym Leader scouting feature all the way up to November 2015. Keep in mind, this was mere months before the game would get revealed. According to the specifications, here's how the feature would work. And here's the list of potential gym candidates that were decided by this point. Development had progressed far enough that we have this developmental image of a feature, further proof that it was deep in development. However, on October 15, the number of scoutable characters had been reduced to 8 per version, and so the ability to swap gym leaders was removed, along with one of the planned rewards. Then on November 16, it was revealed that 2 of the rewards were supposed to be Mega Evolution Stones, suggesting that originally you were supposed to unlock the Mega Stones through this mode, which would explain so much. But honestly, I'm more amazed seeing the Gym Leader scouting feature still in production this late into development. It's staggering to learn just how much of the game was different even 2 months before the reveal trailer dropped. On December 2nd, 2015, another major piece would fall into place. The Wishiwashi battle document, which detailed its schooling transformation, though the translation lists Magikarp. Possibly because the Japanese name is literally Koiking, but I'm not exactly sure. What makes this document especially interesting is where it was found, in the same folder as the Zygarde design file. And it brought me back to the Pokemon Z video, because many people in the comments did theorize that Zygarde's scrapped swarm mechanic from Pokemon Z was directly reworked into Wishiwashi's schooling ability. This connection is further strengthened by another file in the same folder, labeled Specifications Migrated from Kujira, though the contents of this specific document involved just a small little description on Vivillon. But yeah, there may actually be a direct link between the Zygarde and Wishiwashi mechanics after all. From there, I'd like to highlight some images of the game from February 2016, just a few weeks before the game would be officially revealed. From what I know, it's pretty much impossible to get your hands on the beta Sun and Moon builds, so even finding any kind of gameplay scraps from this era is huge. And lastly, here are images from April 2016. Strangely, the protagonist is wearing alternate clothing, and there's just no explanation for it. And with that, we've now walked through the complete set of documents from Pokemon Sun and Moon. This video was absolutely stacked, and while I recommend going back and rewatching and taking your own personal notes, if you're interested, I have 2 more videos on Sun and Moon, as well as a whole series diving into this kind of stuff. But if you feel like you learned something new, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.